Welcome to Global Talks by PavLyfe, a podcast about redefining healthcare through a global perspective, allowing you to become informed and involved. In each episode, we deliver the best hard-hitting analysis and discussion of what is currently impacting the healthcare landscape, with guests from a variety of industries. Now, here's your host, Pavan Lohia.
Welcome back. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about healthcare and education, two very unique and intertwined fields. With my next guest, I discuss the current state of both our healthcare and education system and what the future looks like for you. My next guest is a leading innovator and expert in politics, health, and education. He's also currently the director of online learning and a lecturer at the City University of New York Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, Dr. Sergio Costa. Welcome to the show, Dr. Costa, and thank you for being here. I want to start by asking how you've navigated yourself to become the director of online learning, the School of Public Health.
Sure. So there's a little bit of a complicated history. As I was finishing my PhD way back in the day, I was seeing, the innovation that was happening around me. Back then, learning management systems had no frills,
Right.
but excited me enough to go deeper into this. And also, the technology was emerging at a time when I was a teaching assistant, and I was trying to find some sources and some ways to make the class interactive and to make it easier. Many of us lived outside of the Boston area, so I went to Boston University at the time. So I did my teaching at Boston University using all these tools, Blackboard back in the day, Real Player for archived newscasts, from NPR, that sort of thing.
Right.
And while I was finishing up my PhD, I decided to take a position with Pearson Education, which at the time was a leading textbook publisher and was really at the forefront of a lot of innovation in education, including the emergence of custom books and also fully integrated and full of frills learning platforms like their MyLab series, which is still in production and very much adopted by universities all over the place. And then as I was doing that, I got tired of the private sector, and I had an opportunity to come over to the public sector, and as a teaching faculty, but also as a director of online learning in two instances, one at a university in the Midwest and now in New York City. I don't know what the future brings, but certainly it's been a very enjoyable ride. And the stream, I would say, is that I've always been intrigued by how education is delivered. So as a student way back in the day, it helped me to think about how I could, as a teacher, use the things that I would expect, from a student's perspective as well. So I think that I started and I embarked on this at a time when I was a student, but thinking about being a teacher, and then after that, sort of becoming an online learning professional to look very holistically at how education is delivered.
Right. So obviously we've come a very long way from just writing on paper and taking notes in that fashion with the advent of computers, tablets, phones, you name it. Do you see any effect of how students are actually getting their knowledge?
Yeah, I think, with respect to technology, I think it depends on what universities and where you are in the world. So I think at the end of the day, when I look at all these transformations over the course of time and in my career, I find that distance plays a big role. We're all busier. We have longer commutes. We're all in traveling here and there. And actually, a lot of our graduate students are fully they're full-time employed, and they're managing very complicated lives. And I find at the end of the day, you can have the more expensive tools like the iPads and so forth, but we know that there's been some limitation around this, especially from an international setting. First of all, iPads are very expensive, and
Right.
they're expensive here, but certainly in other parts of the world. So there are limits, it's not so much that the technology is magical. It's just, you have to start with what are your immediate needs, and then ask the question whether technology makes that easier or harder or cost prohibitive or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think it's a balance. It really depends on the circumstances on the ground. But one thing that has really driven me as a professional is that I never start with technology first. I always start with what are the educational needs, what are we trying to accomplish, and then looking for the most proximate, more easily achievable, reachable solutions that might be out there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, obviously, having experience in the private sector and now being at the City University of New York,
Mm-hmm.
when thinking of online learning and developing it, do you think there's a question to be asked for whether it's a university or a high school, elementary school? Do you think that these schools should be going to private companies to build their programs, or should it be developed in-house? And why? I mean, doesn't that make a significant difference of how that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's also a very delicate balance because it really depends on the institution and where they are. I wouldn't necessarily start with how much money an institution has, but and I know that you're not suggesting that, but I just had this conversation this afternoon. You can throw all the money that you want, onto some, projects, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll have really good outcomes. So I am a proponent of the train-the-trainer model. So throughout my career, I've dealt with online learning skeptics. I've dealt with faculty who have not been very excited about teaching in a new way. But I've in two rounds of this, so I've been involved. It turns out at developing schools at a very nascent stage, brand new schools from the ground up physically.
Right.
And no one gives you a magic book as to what's going to
What's the
work.
secret formula?
Right. So it's a very slow process. So it's I find that the show and tell, so whatever you hear from the faculty, what the goals are, then you provide examples of what it could look like, and then they ask, well, how do I do this? So it's sort of like thinking about, here's a menu of options. This is what it looks like, and talk to me about what you see, what resonates with you, and I will do what I can to help you get there.
Sure.
And yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you come across this as you were developing your work on creating new programs in public health, especially
Constantly.
in an online format?
Yeah, constantly. And I can say, looking back, it's difficult. It's not a very comfortable, pleasant experience, to come in with, a very new way of doing what an institution has done up until that point. And you always have, I wouldn't necessarily say it's tense, but I would say that there's always hesitation, there's skepticism, there's always the, obstacles and, and whatnot, and the what ifs, what if we do this and then we find, that a whole cohort of students, haven't learned a thing, but these are not, I would say, I've worked over the course of my career to dispel myths. I think I'm pretty good with that. And I think that one of my strengths is using diplomacy and, and just working slow, in a slow fashion with faculty wherever they may be in their skill set spectrum. So, I would say that for the most part, success is reached. You've done you've sort of trained faculty, actually in both institutions that I can think of, 70% to about to 75% of the faculty were at least trained in online course development and online course management. And I would say about 50% of those that have been trained actually have developed learning modules in their courses, and
wow.
yeah, and they have, would they say that they've been like overnight champions and evangelists, for online learning themselves? No, it's hard work to build a really good learning experience in the online setting or hybrid setting for that matter. And I think, it's just a mix, of, of how people, feel, about it. But I can
Yeah.
tell you what drives that, what drives a big part of that when faculty choose to develop these learning modules and then continue to teach in these formats is that the students really vote with their feet. So they're enrolling in these in sections, in droves, and we have to address, what students, expect and need. So as I said, a lot of our graduate students, a huge proportion of our graduate students are full-time employed, and they have really long commutes here at the City University of New York. It was found through a survey done some years back that the average commute time for a CUNY student is 45 minutes one way. So, even though the City University of New York has, over 25 campuses, and I think it's now 27 in the city of New York and all 5 boroughs, there's this misperception that the CUNY student is a local student. So if you're in Staten Island, you're going to the College of Staten Island. That's not
Definitely.
the case. Yeah.
And I was going to say that I've experienced the kind of different phases of online learning. I think between attending community college, my undergraduate, now being in New York, one of my late professors actually from my undergraduate, he has teaching experience of probably close to 30 years. And at my undergrad, they had launched this new program, and they basically actually piloted it in our public health program. He was actually one of the leaders, and surprisingly, for somebody who was used to teaching in an in-person format, he was able to really develop his modules very well. I think there was some initial pushback from students, again, just, different platforms, from the transition from Blackboard to that platform, and, not all classes being there. So I think those are just like small things, but they eventually become bigger. And going into public health, I think it's a interesting subject to actually teach in an online format, because although some parts are purely theoretical and you can, have it be in this online format, whether it's taped or not, I would say there's definitely a struggle in more applied areas. And I'm not sure if online learning has really been there, regardless of the platform or not. I do see that being a struggle. And I think even apart from public health, but other science majors, social science majors as well, or for that matter, any type of program, I'm not sure how they'll be able to kind of translate some of these skills that you're picking up in a classroom, whether it's social skills, these applied skills. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges too now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you make an excellent point. I do. I am aware of these criticisms of online learning. However, I would say that certainly in a professional degree like public health, there should be plenty of opportunities, whether you're in a face-to-face course, a hybrid, or fully online. There should be plenty of opportunities for students to apply their learning out in the field. So I really try to think about the way that I teach in terms of having deliverables in a course, as to have things that you could showcase in a portfolio. So while social skills are very important in the classrooms and socialization, or amongst your students and so forth, I I think it's good to make that connection. But there's nothing that really prohibits students from doing that in a virtual session. So in my course, I use group work over 65% of the grade. In my teaching, certainly in the MPH core, where I think is the opportunity for students to really develop skills that they should build on throughout their concentration courses and all the way up to their capstone, is to sort of self-manage themselves. So I'm developing secondary skills, but they're secondary, but they're very important skills in terms of how to manage themselves, how to create a communication plan with accountability among themselves, and how to do that virtually. So
Right.
whether it's on a weekend or whatever, you sort of come to an agreement over time, and then you pick the technology that you're most comfortable with. And I've really been very surprised, as someone who is, spends, his career knowing, a lot about this technology, that at every single instance, every iteration of this course that I teach, I learned from somebody about a new tool that I haven't heard about or I haven't thought about being used, that way. So I really leave it up to groups, and I really see the groups, developing and developing these skills. And I often hear at the end of the course how there was some trepidation about group work, and there's always hesitation about group work, as you know,
Yeah, of course.
and
That's a struggle.
there's always 2 to 4 groups that have stepped out, that really had make a point to reach me to tell me that it really was a very pleasurable experience, and that the group, when they inevitably they might take a face-to-face course. Certainly in public universities, it's often the case that that the vast proportion of students take in-person classes, but the online courses they kind of use it sort of a way to supplement. We suspect
Right.
it's to cut back on commutes, to achieve a better work-life balance, but they will see each other in a face-to-face course, but they have built those social, roots, and, hopefully they'll be, friends going forward. But we all know that after graduate work, there's lots of opportunities to socialize out there,
Very true.
and you'll know a whole bunch of other people, and that's what we want to do. We want our students to go out there and to drive the passion that got them to this point around public health and in related areas. To go out into the field, into all kinds of sectors, to get to know people and get to know stakeholders, and identify the levers for change.
So, and it's great that you mentioned stakeholders and your passion. So, I know you have a political background as well, combined with public health. And I think obviously the big thing going on right now in general is how healthcare is dominating the landscape of the United States and many other parts of this world. Just this past week, there were some comments made on the news about what healthcare is. And there was some responses, mainly just saying, I think in the United States, a lot of people think that healthcare is insurance. And I think as public health professional, as a public health student, and you as a public health professional, that is definitely not what healthcare is. And I think right now, is the messaging off on the political landscape, or is it also just as a country or communities that are not really understanding of what healthcare really means?
Well, I mean, you mentioned some very, very key words. I mean, as you were posing the question, healthcare, we tend to think about in a very individual sense. So, insurance insures the individual. I have a problem, I show up, and it's still an individual solution to a very individual problem. But you mentioned the word community, and I think there is, a real disconnect certainly here in the United States, I can't say, in other places abroad, but certainly here in the United States about, healthcare, in an individual context, and then this thing that we call community health and investment in resources, investment in institutions, investment in, in the environment and natural resources and technology to bring about health change at the population level. So there's always this tension between how I would say lay people or people who may not be familiar with public health to think about, health in the individual context versus population health. There's always been that tension there. So when people come into public health or they hear about public health or are considering, a degree, and it's like, well, where are my options? What's this thing, this public health? And then you read a description about what public health does, and there's a trigger in the mind, it's like there's sort of an epiphany. It's like, wow, this really makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think so there is that existent tension, but you're asking a very, very big question. In terms of the political and the political landscape, I think two things. So I see health in all. I look at the world through a health in all lens. I see public health in just about everything. I'm not sure if it's always there, but I certainly am trained, my brain is trained, to see that. It's like, what are the health implications for this educational technology, for this innovation in transportation, for this, a product, so now we're going to paper to something else,
it changes your worldview.
Right. So I see, health in health and all. I don't think that everybody's really trained to see it that way, but it is a muscle that you build over time, and certainly it's certainly a goal in my teaching to develop that skill in my students with a hope that they go into, like I said, to different sectors and sort of apply that lens. So that's number one. Number two, I think I look at health as inherently political, and I know that within the public health profession, certainly that up until an article, I'm thinking of this article that was published in the AJPH, and I think in 2012 by Daniel Goldberg, and it was called "Against the Very Idea of the Politicization of Public Health," and he makes this argument that public health is inherently a political thing, and that public health as a field needs to come to terms with this and deal with it, and deal with it in a very transparent, obvious, deliberate way. So I when I look back, about the things that I've there's lots of things that have influenced me, but I came from a field, political science, where we're taught to see, politics and everything.
Of course.
So, and I prevail upon a number of models and public policy processes. I'm always looking at, frameworks that help and, sort of make sense of the world around us. What I do in my teaching is I do try to develop that lens of, health in all, and seeing health in the most, the most non-obvious, ways. But I also teach my students to, prevail upon these frameworks, primarily to think about how to influence policy in ways other than, the testimonies, the op-eds, that we do. Those are important tasks, but I try to curate case studies and readings and examples and demonstrations about how stakeholders were sought out, how alliances were built, how opportunities came up in very unexpected ways, how time, how geography frames and impacts the development of movements and policy evolution. And I try to do that in a comparative lens way as well. So I am a comparativist by training. So I want my students to look at other parts of the world, but also think with a research cap on to think about what are some factors and variables that might be in play that have, led to outcomes in country A versus country B. So if we're looking for, two similar developed, democracies, why is it that policies that, that have been championed have been successful in country A and not country B? So I want my students to sort of think in those terms. But at the end of the day, I see health as very, very political, as inherently political, but it's not something to be running away from. It's something to contend with, because that is the reality on the ground, and especially today in an age where, there's a lot of disinformation campaigns. There's a very strong potential for us to see a real deterioration in successes that have led to this point, that we really have to grapple with the new political realities on the ground. Is like, how do you deal with, politics? I mean, do testimonies work anymore? Have, politicians really come to their conclusions? Are there barriers that you can't really overcome because of, of interest group, loyalties or lobbying efforts and too much money in politics? So we have to be really creative about how do we overcome those challenges by, prevailing upon the examples that we can around us, and certainly political science and public health as, a joint, as a joint field.
Very interconnected.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think just even myself, when I think about it, that where I really started to get my healthcare, public health, just I think overarching information. And I was actually very perplexed because I didn't have a direct source of information. There's no Google of healthcare, essentially. I mean, Google obviously serves many purposes, but given you have these platforms like a WebMD, and then you also have all the research articles. There's a whole issue on, is a lot of public health research even reaching the population that it affects, and the stakeholders that are involved. But I think now that I'm pursuing my master's, I really think is the knowledge that we're getting as a health professional, whether it's from the high school level all the way to the professional level as a master's, doctoral student. I think now you're starting to see many medical doctors have public health backgrounds, nurses having public health backgrounds.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I also see lots of opportunities for public health as a discipline. Its curriculum to change enormously. I think that it has to. It really has no choice to meet the needs of the future. So among these skills that I can immediately think of are, beginning with soft skills, resilience, leadership in different modalities, because, there are institutions where leadership can mean different things, So, I mean, can you really be a leader where, where there's an institution that doesn't allow for alternate voices? It's not something, I mean, you just have to be, prepared to know what leadership means in whatever organization you're talking about. Cultural sensitivity is another one, so cultural competence, of course. Negotiation is another. Trust building, teamwork skills that I've mentioned earlier. Collaboration etiquette. These are the soft skills. These sort of like people skills, and there's never an end or a limit to how you can develop those. So as careers, as people become more mature and more experienced in their orbits, these should certainly improve. But there are some skills, some hard skills that are drawn from other disciplines that I think are critical for a future in public health. Project management is one. So very right. So very process-based skills that may or may not use technology. there are project management software out there, and we know from project management that when you're building things anew, that coordinating teams, coordinating collaboration among teams is a very, very critical piece. Project management is taught in business schools. It's taught in other disciplines as well. Do we teach it in public health? I think we do, but I don't think that it's even across all programs. Strategic planning and thinking is also another.
Yeah.
How do you define goals? How do you bring stakeholders together to not only define those goals, but to prioritize those goals as well? Change management is also another. That's a very business schooly, type of concept, and I think that is super in need in public health. So organizational learning, how do you build your current workforce, especially when we're dealing with labor shortages in the future? I think it was the DeBeaumont Foundation some years back at a NACHO meeting had said that by 2023, the public health workforce, a very large percentage of the public health workforce will leave the profession for a host of reasons. So how do you keep good people? How do you bring in and keep those people? Expertise development and so forth in those organizations. Communication is another. And I think that strategic communication, how do you talk to different audiences? How do you mobilize communities effectively with or without technology? How do you frame a problem in a way that resonates with your audience? So you mentioned earlier about data and public health research, but there are ways to not only grab the attention, right. There not only ways to grab the attention, but you have to keep the attention. So you're also time limited too. So we have to work with cognitive science in order to know what's possible in that and what's possible with that particular frame. The Frameworks Institute, by the way, does excellent work around this, and they're sort of they can it's comprised of people from very different fields, but on their website, they have a number of case studies where they work with public health departments, they work with local governments, state governments, multitude of organizations to test messages, to test framing, whether it's in PSAs, whether it's in films or whatever, and they look for impact. So they're evaluating as well. What else? What other skills? Facilitation skills is another. How do you bring stakeholders and together? You might have alliances that don't really consist of the people that you would normally think, but how you bring unlikely allies to the table and manage that. So these are just some examples.
Yeah, and I think, building these skills, I don't think it's necessarily that it's just taught in the classroom or by pursuing a degree, but I think especially for professionals in the healthcare realm, I think these are skills that are constantly developing and also constantly evolving. And I think that there's definitely some disconnect out there between healthcare professionals, depending on their specialties and whatnot, of that evolution of education. But when you bring up the notion of there's professionals that are going to be leaving the workforce, I've definitely seen that. I've read things about that, and I personally know people who've left the healthcare industry, especially doctors, senior researchers, because of the costs involved, the struggles that they face as individuals. And although myself, I think I advocate for public health education, as an alumni now, or soon to be, of another public health school, I've always reached out to students, current and incoming, to pursue public health or public health related concentrations. But I think, especially now being in a master's program, I see that cost is a really big deal, and also access to education. So I almost fear that cost is driving students away from pursuing degrees. I personally know friends that have not pursued degrees because of the cost. And even if we downplay cost for a moment, then there's things of, having to move, having to, create a new life. And you're at some point, you're not just yourself. You can have a family, you can have kids, you can have parents, those things all kind of play into life. And I don't know how that really impacts your average student, but you can definitely see that with even just at a national level where we are having the debt crisis for students, current and former. And I'm just worried, will that hurt the innovation that happens in the United States education, or will it just also impact, as we see now, there are shortages of public health professionals, shortages of doctors, nurses, even in my own role as a clinical researcher at Mount Sinai, we've had struggles to find quality researchers who are able to do the type of work that's necessary. And now being in Washington, D.C. and seeing it at not only the clinical level, but also the political and, more broader level of, states and all that, it is very perplexing to me, really where healthcare is going to be just a few years from now, as well as the people who are going to make up healthcare.
Yeah. These are very, very serious questions for sure.
Yeah, it's not a light topic at all.
No, it's not. But I think, but let me just start with saying, what I've been observing in the past, the last year or two. I think that, I know this won't be good news, for people like, my colleagues in the public, maybe even in the private sector, who have taught in traditional education, graduate degree, formal graduate degrees, where students come out with a degree. I do see a rise of alternative educational providers out there, and they're popping up mostly for skills that are in high demand, but they really don't require like a research degree or something like that. Those are emerging. So I'm seeing some models right now where employers even are willing to pay for the education of an individual or groups of individual. They commit certain amount of time to the organization, and in return their education is paid for. And a lot of these organizations in these particular skill areas that I'm talking about, they're really overlooking, on purpose, the fact that the student might not have a degree, and they might even explicitly say that it doesn't really matter. They have a certain, skills that they're looking for in a person. They just really want, the tasks to be done, and they're willing to train those individuals to master those skills, and then to commit to the organization. So that's one model. I do see a rise in apprenticeships, and I think that actually, does have a bright opportunity, because, like the previous example that I gave, apprenticeships is sort of like sustained fieldwork opportunities where students in a program could have a promise, of employment. Other incentives, perhaps, to be discussed depending on the institution, but among them could also be, education paid for, or a portion of that. And it does have the opportunity for the student to not only build that trust and relationship with an organization, to have a really strong early start to a bright career, but to also reinforce their skills that they've learned throughout. So I've also been a proponent, but I really haven't, thought about how we overcome the, required credentials, especially in these traditional institutions that we're thinking of, like public health,
Right.
health centers, health agencies, certainly in government. I don't see, at least for the immediate future, for the need of bachelor's or even a master's degree to go away. But I do believe that in order for people to grow within organizations and to make way for new incoming, newly minted graduates or people in early stages of their career, that continuing education and helping build people with professional development skills is very important. And I also like to think of programs outside of the traditional model. So let's say if you were to do a non-credit bearing program where, you've defined or if, you've done the research to inform the curriculum where, your median middle level, manager wants to move up to a more senior level position. This is what it would take. That, you could do like weekend offerings or sort of a compressed continuing education offering, a program to give them a certificate or something like that that could enable them to grow within the organization. So having been both in the public and the private side, I'd say one of the constraints of working in a public institution is that there are lots of rules in place, many of which are for good reason, but the ability to innovate, the ability to work beyond, let's say, a 15-week semester model is simply impossible. And I think that universities like the City and University of New York has to evolve and has to be prepared to respond to that, because I do see the risks ahead. And I think that there might be alternate educational providers who are not teaching students, to be holistic, to be ethically responsible, individuals, or to teach those skills, about, empathy, to teach them, values and so forth. That they will jump in and exploit that vacuum. So, and there's a real danger because I think, I look at, I look at developments within ed tech, and I think there's a lot of trash out there, to be honest. And, people have very big goals, but, it's not uncommon to see people in these, in the boards of these, ed tech organizations to have no experience whatsoever, in front of a classroom or having taught or no education at all. So, and there's a danger because we don't want to be teaching a generation to, come up with, let's say, technical solutions like, coding and, and data science, but, then losing track of what that means for people or thinking about impact on populations. It's not just a coding challenge. It's people that will have to contend with the outcomes of this with this software, whether you intend them or not. So there is no reset, for some of the things like some of these social media companies have done. I mean, they're the societal fabric. I mean, for all to see is coming apart. And what was a very good idea at the beginning, with sort of like uploading pictures and status and following friends, has become quite a different creature with, I'm afraid, very long-lasting, consequences for society. So I think that universities have to contend with, with non-traditional models, with alternate models to meet the needs of the public health workforce of the future, for sure.
Yeah, and I think both private and public organizations are also going to have to maneuver through that. I mean, I would say even from personal experience, I know that even being on the younger side of my colleagues, it is very challenging. Even students who are going through all these degrees and trainings, there is sometimes even myself, I consider, is this enough to pursue what I want to do? And I ultimately hope that it doesn't detract a student from, hey, I don't want to pursue this degree anymore. I don't want to pursue this type of career anymore because of these barriers. And I think it's not just, companies are on the hook for it. I think it's going to be universities, educators, and your organization itself. And I don't know if there's a quick and easy solution, nor would I expect there to be, but there definitely has to be, I guess, a conversation just like we're having about it, to really focus in on that, since things are ever changing now in our technology-based world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and as you're currently working on developing online education, are you seeing that there's going to be this kind of switch in students, or in even companies or educators themselves, that, hey, we need to really adapt to this way of learning and thinking for the future of our students and the impact these students are going to have out on the world?
Yeah, there's no question. I do see the next 5-10 years to see a tremendous amount of new technology, easier to use. I think that's just going to be logarithmically, it's just going to happen. And I think that's going to, I wouldn't say force, but that would certainly be a very centripetal force, for institutions to come together, cohere around a very new way of teaching. It's not novel to me, but I have to say that, it is quite new for a lot of faculty, even though online learning has been around in, different, variants for, 15, 20 years. And if you want to go back, way, way, way back, as correspondence, what they call correspondence education, correspondence courses, right, way back in the day. I think that I do think that new technology, more accessible technology, is going to emerge in the next 5 to 10 years, certainly. And I think that there is what I see as a trend to make things easier for educators. And provided that you do enough user design interface, you've beta tested your products, I don't see any reason why these products couldn't evolve in such a way that really would be useful for faculty and would really make for very interactive, very easy, to create very interactive and impactful learning experiences. I certainly see that happening, but like I said, I'm going to preempt that with knowing full well that there's a lot of garbage out there. So, but there's also a lot of good stuff.
And there's people like you working on it, so that definitely is a little reassuring.
I try to keep my eye on it. I think I'm spot on with my principles, and I think that the most people that I know that are in this space, certainly that have some exposure to teaching, they're aligned to these principles as well. The problem is that there are all these solutions out there that we don't know what they're doing with the data that you provide, and frankly, they may have what may look like a very good product, but actually at the end of the day really doesn't, really didn't meet, its promises. So I think that will get better over time. I'm hopeful. I see a lot of students, and I look to them and what they use and how they use their products as sort of a gauge about how things are evolving in ed tech as well. And if they're liking it, then, and if they find it useful, I take a look at the products and I say to myself, well, why don't we try to use this, in the classroom? Flipgrid is an example. It's free, but it does have constraints. You have to have, different kinds of email. I think you have like 2 different kinds of email addresses that you have to use. You can't just use anything, like you have to have a Google email account. But it does have an opportunity for students to sort of record their responses to a discussion board prompt where they're, and not, a text-based, as an alternative to a text-based discussion board blog format. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about the future.
No, it's really good to hear. And I think definitely just having this discussion, you can see that all these like intersects of healthcare, public health, education, formats of learning. It is very interesting, and I think bringing to the audience and even future people is that these are the things that actually impact what we all see, what we learn, and ultimately affecting our public health as we see the world in that way. And definitely, I mean, you're on the forefront of creating these technologies for our students currently and for our future. So I'm excited to see what you're able to do for sure.
Yeah, and I think, my main charge as an educator is to be sure that I'm teaching the right values to my students. And I want that to be a lifelong, commitment to those values. And whether my students as public health, people who hold a master's in public health go to, the gaming industry, the mobile technology industry, we know wherever they're bringing those values wherever they go. So that's why I feel that, contrary to a lot of, colleagues and peers within, our field, that I do want my students to go into different sectors, including the private sector, whether it's for pharmaceuticals or food and beverage companies, to bring those values and become players in those fields for the goals that we want to achieve for the greater good and for the public's health.
Of course, yeah. No, I think all of this is really reshaping healthcare all across the country and in many parts of the world. And as students or as professionals, I think it's great to see the branching out of really what's coming to fruition from all those different parts of education and career workforces. So it'll be very exciting to see the current playing field of healthcare, and then also how it evolves just as different and more diverse people come in and become active participants. So thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion, and we look forward to seeing what happens on the educational aspect of public health.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much, Pavan. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining this episode of Global Talks by PavLyfe with Pavan Lohia. Make sure to visit PavLyfe.com, where you can also subscribe to the podcast and read the PavLyfe blog for perspectives and news on everything healthcare you simply can't get anywhere else. Share your thoughts on the show by rating the show and by connecting with us on social media. Thanks for tuning in. See you in the next episode.